morning everyone! Things to consider when installing, or actually before installing, an Abyss pump or pretty much any other pump as well. First thing that comes to my mind when I walk into public aquariums or private larger home aquarium installations, unfortunately I see the pumps being plumbed in wrong, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's like a bunch of, you know, angles and valves and whatever in front, but there's also the pipe diameter. So just recently when I was in Baltimore, the National Aquarium in Maryland, I saw one of the few A200s that were actually plumbed in quite correctly, so with a 63mm or 2.5 inch on the intake and then 2 inch 50 millimeters out on the outlet of the pump. And that looks very weird on an A200, but it's actually the right size diameter. What you have to consider before actually installing or buying your PVC is think about your tank volume and your desired turnover rate. So if your tank volume, for example, is 500 gallons for all you American friends out there, we are talking about a turnover rate of maybe 10 cubic meters, so 5 times the tank volume, 2,500 gallons. So if you have this tool, you can get that on our web shop and our dealers. You just put in here your 10,000 liters per hour, which is 10 cubic meters, and then you can check your pipe diameter. So on the rear it actually gives you recommendations. So for the pressure side, we're not to exceed 1.5 to 2 meters per second, which is 5 to 6.5 feet per second. On the suction side, you should be at 1 to 1.5 meters per second, which is 3 to 5 feet per second. So if you go to the velocity and you see 2 meters per second, that's actually 40 is not enough. Even though the outlet of the pump might be 40, but if you check the manual, it'll say, please make sure you have the right pipe diameters. Usually it's 1 gauge up from the connections of the pump, which would be 50 millimeters, and which according to this scale would be the correct value, because at 50 millimeters you're at 1.5 meters, so that's right in the range. Remember, this is the outer diameter, not the inner diameter, and the inner diameter is of course what counts. Same thing is valid for the gallons per hour, gallons per minute. So if you have 2,500 gallons per hour, that would be this, basically equal our value that we had right now. The velocity is not to exceed 6.5, so we are at 2 inch inner diameter, which will not be enough because of the wall thickness, so you need to step up to 2.5 inch, and that's why you end up at 2.5 inch. Those are things to consider prior to installing the pump and purchasing all the equipment. We will show you that in a live case in our lab in a few moments, but first things first, some considerations to have in mind when you're installing the pump. One very important thing, which I also just saw recently, people have installed the pump next to their outlet pipe. So this is the pipe where the water has to go in. So what they did was they made their bulkhead fitting, and then they went up, and then they went down, and then they went into the pipe. So, which gives you 390s, and it's 0.9 or 0.7, but you can look that up in any handbook just to have a number. What they should have done is just unscrew those 4 screws we offer on the A200 and A400, and then you can actually turn the pump head around to point into this direction. So 90 degrees, which doesn't matter on this one whether you turn it, and then you could use 2 45s to actually reach the same level. And the 45s I think are at 0.3. So comparing these two, you're going from 0.6 in friction losses to 2.1 if you do the other way. So that's a significant difference, and that's why it's important to make those design considerations. Another thing which very often happens is that the pumps are completely plumbed wrong on the suction side. So that's also usually an installation issue. So when you're an aquarist and you need to plumb a new system, please make sure to come up with some ideas on where to place the pump. So I've seen pictures where, as from the top view, you have a tank or whatever you're pulling out of. The tank has a connection here. Somebody placed the pump here with its intake right there. So what happens, and I actually have that as a picture, connection goes in, 90 degree comes out, another 90 degree goes in, and then a 45 degree, and then another weird construction. So you're ending up having like 3 or 4 different angles into this construction. So there's no straight intake into the pump, at least our pumps, which are not self-priming, so they cannot create a high underpressure on air. And that's for a reason, because an impeller wheel can't be as efficient with air at the same time as it is with water, because the viscosity of those two mediums is just completely different. We have designed the pumps to be most efficient when sucking in freely, so mounted below the water level. That's why these pumps are also very sensitive to any obstructions in the intake. If you block the intake like this, you're losing an efficiency of easily 25 to 30% on the pump's performance, and that's why it's very important to make sure that your intake is basically free. If you have a self-priming pump, they are more tolerant, but still, this, even for a self-priming pump, would be great pressure loss. There's also something else to consider when mounting with an angle in front of the pump, and I will show you because I have that in my tank. So we have our pump head here, that's the pump, here's the outlet. If you mount a 90-degree angle in front of the pump to not pull air into the pump, or if you have your plumbing going in with a 90-degree elbow, what happens is that the water comes in here. So on this corner you will have those micro turbulences, and around this corner you will have those micro turbulences, and here you will have micro turbulences. So you're actually pressing the water due to the centripetal force to the outside of this elbow. So what happens on the inside of the pump, here's your impeller wheel. So you're actually pushing more water pressure on the top and less on the bottom.
You are such an artist, Alex. Really.
Right? Well, I think you get the point. So there's a bearing in the pump, and then there's a shaft in the pump here. So what happens now is that you actually have more mechanical force on the upper half of the impeller wheel, which, if we put this line in here, you'll create a force that actually tilts the impeller wheel, and that reduces your efficiency. That's one part. It also makes sure that you have more wear on the upper half of your bearing on this side, because the shaft is continuously bent to the top. We're using a hydrodynamic bearing, so in general, in between the bearing materials, there's always a fluid film of water. So if you push that to one side by pressuring it, then you will just have more wear on the bearings, so your bearings just won't last as long. That's one important consideration. The other thing is, when you have things like this, and I'm using, for example, a 45 on my tank, what can happen on your pump head here? Such an artist, I know. Even if the water level is here, and now you switch off the pump for whatever reason, feeding break, or because you need to clean it, the water might rush back into the pump and then dragging air with it, and then creating basically an airlock in here. So this is water, and this is water, of course, so it's completely submerged, but this is all air. So when you start up the pump, the impeller wheel is basically sitting only 1/3 in the water, and then the pump just can't start up. So in my case, the pumps are using very little power. They're just running at roughly 55%. That's where it doesn't really matter. If you deliver 14 cubic meters per hour, that's a different story, because then you have a lot more momentum and force on that. To get rid of this, you should actually, if your sump is big enough, make sure that on any intake, on any pump, and that's, as I said, valid for pretty much every other pump model as well. So any given pump, let's say you sized out your plumbing to be 63 millimeters, and let's say this pump offers 50 millimeter, just like our A200. What you should do is you're using a short reduction to go from 50 to 63. Then you place your fitting on top of that, which will be bulkhead, so you can take that actually off. Then you have your 63 millimeter pipe, and this part should be at least 5 times 63. So 5 times the outer diameter of the pipe you should have as a straight run in front of the pump. So if you want to make sure you have this in your sump, then please just place your 45 on this end, and this will make sure that by the time the water reaches the impeller wheel, it's almost exactly the same pressure throughout the whole area that enters basically the impeller wheel. So the pump can be much more efficient on that. I think we should have a look in the lab to show you all of this physically, and let's go. we put up a little test system here. Basically, we are compensating the head pressure with this drain pipe, which is basically gravity fed. This eliminates the raised head pressure. So we're measuring the head pressure on this pressure line right here. Anything that goes after this connector will be measured. So right now it's 0. I've set the whole thing up already to run at 46.9%, which should give us a nice flow rate of roughly 5 cubic meters. Well, all right, that worked obviously. So there's 5.2 roughly, and here we have 50 watts, 49 watts with 46.9%. This is the flow rate that the design is actually made for. So we are running this with 32 millimeter acrylic pipe with a wall thickness of roughly 2.2 millimeters. We are exactly at that spot right now where the plumbing would be the right size for 5 cubic meters. Now, if we go up to a higher speed, we'll see that there's not a maximum coming out that the pump would be able to do. So we'll dial this up. Oh, by the way, the pressure was around 0.01 bars, which is roughly 10 centimeters in pressure loss. Now, if we dial this up and we raise the turnover rate, we're exceeding this little measuring device. So the pump is running at 100% with 200 watts. We're only getting 8.5, 8.6 cubic meters per hour. So with investing 200 watts instead of 49, we're only getting roughly 60% more flow. That's the big difference in the performance for having the right pipe diameter to your turnover that you desire in your system. Also notice that the head pressure is raised from 0.01 around that to 0.08, 0.07. So we're talking about 6 times the head pressure just by friction of the pipe, and then also those 2 soft elbows that we have up there. So now we're going to transform this into a worse plumbing idea to give you an idea of how much more you need to spend for getting the same value. So I'm stopping the pump, draining the system, and then we're going to unscrew the top and put this nice little variant on this with, instead of 2 soft elbows, we're using 6 90-degree hard elbows. There you go. We didn't change the plumbing a lot. We didn't extend it by too much. It's just maybe a couple of centimeters. Now we're starting up the pump with exactly the same value as we did before, 46.9%. And guess what? We have less than 4 cubic meters around that. I mean, the ultrasonic device still shows 4, but here we are roughly at 4, and before that we were at 5, so which gives us roughly 20% loss in turnover rate with the same settings. Notice that the power just went down from 49 to 43. You'll see in a second here. That is because we're delivering less water. That's why we are also using less energy. So the physical work that is being done by the pump has become less, and that's why it's also using lesser energy. So when you're raising the head pressure, usually the power consumption drops to 42 watts. Notice that the head pressure though has changed significantly from 0.01 to already 0.04 in average. 4 times the head pressure by just having 6 90-degree hard elbows as compared to 2 soft elbows. Let's first try to reach those 5 cubic meters again to give you an idea of how much more energy you have to invest now to reach the same turnover rate. So we're dialing this up, and you'll see the measurement device go up. So now we are at 5, I would say. That shows 5.2. So we are at 83 watts. In the first place, with the first plumbing, it was 49, and now we are at 82, 83. We'll wait for the reading in just a second. So that's roughly 60% more power usage to have the same turnover. See, it switches from 82, 83. That's for the same value. So just because you plumbed the system wrong, you're using 60% more energy, and that's where it becomes really relevant to have the right diameters and the right plumbings. This usually happens in retrospect. So you have a system, then you need to replumb it, or you need to add something to it. And you can imagine, like in a public aquarium, for example, I mean, right now we're talking about 30 watts, right? That we're using more, but they have 200 pumps behind the scenes. And we're not talking about only those giant pumps, because all the engineers usually and tank designers, they take precautions in doing the right plumbing. Not always ideal, sometimes it's cost limited as well, so there's other factors that go into that, but nobody really cares about all the small pumps. So usually behind the scenes you'll see, I don't know, 100, 200 systems with smaller pumps in there, and if every of those pumps using 30 watts more, then it already becomes significant. For you at home, 30 watts is not a huge saving, but if you have an A400 or if you have a 750 watt pump running your pond, that's when it becomes really relevant, because then you're very easily at a couple of €100 or $100 per year that you're saving. Now we'll show you the biggest difference if we dial up the pump to full speed. Let's see how much the plumbing can take and how much the pressure against that is going up. We have a pressure of 0.25 bars, which is 2.5 meters, in a system that shouldn't have any head pressure. It's just friction losses right now in those PVC elbows and of course the plumbing itself. Pump is running at 100% and we are only reaching 7.3 cubic meters, whereas before it was almost 9 cubic meters. So the pump has already raised speed, so the RPMs on the pump already went up by roughly 200 RPMs due to the fact that it's not using as much energy as it should use. So then it speeds up at 100% and goes a little bit beyond. We call that an overdrive. That's why the pumps are so stable against head pressure. So they're still doing a good job, but you have roughly 12% less flow in the whole system at full speed, plus friction losses and noise. I mean, the noise is significantly higher in a plumbing like this as it would be if you would have a larger plumbing and slower flow speeds. What you can also see here on the intake very clearly is that if you have turbulences, this is by far not an ideal situation for a pump. So it's dragging in air. It's also drawing this little vortex here, which means that the water is actually circulating when it's entering that 45-degree elbow, and that's where you can see that this can't be very efficient. So if you have a longer run with no air getting into the pump, it will be much healthier. This can also cause a terrible TGP problem. Your total gas pressure will go up because you're dragging in bubbles into the pump and then compressing it. So when you have a higher head pressure, of course, so we're talking about 3 to 4 meters maybe going up, then you will have a higher gas pressure in that water coming into your tank, and that can lead to basically diverse disease with your fishes, so they get pop eyes and all sorts of problems. I also wanted to show you the effect of the pump not wanting to start because it's got an air trap in, because that's something that we get very often. We'll now drain the system. And then we'll make sure that the pump has an air trap inside. So now the pump is empty. And now we have the situation that maybe the returning water has collected some air bubbles, an air trap into the pump, and you can actually see that there's a bubble right in front of that 45 degree. Now when I start up the pump with a value that it would usually start, pump is running, there's no water coming out, and the pump says dry running, and it'll start again and it'll go to dry running. So imagine you have a power failure on your system, water returns, and then that error happens a couple of times and you're not home. What will happen is that the driver at some point will go into safe lock. So if the same error continues to happen for a couple of times, then the driver will lock itself out to make sure that the pump doesn't start up like 1,000 times and then actually gets damaged. At some point it will go to safe lock, and you see that right here. If it's safe lock, which is the error 140, before you confirm the errors, they are always written in plain text. So just make sure to read before you press any buttons. So safe lock means you cannot switch the pump on anymore on the driver. What you have to do is repower the driver, and then the pump will start up normally. So what you can do now to reduce this problem with the airlock or with the air trap inside is drill a tiny hole onto the top of that 45 to make sure that if the pump ever stops, the impeller wheel is completely covered with water, and a 2mm or 3mm hole in that 50mm elbow will make sure that there's always water in the system, and then the pump can start up normally. That's a big issue actually for people that use pumps like that, so that's why I always recommend put a little hole in there. But you have to make sure, of course, that there's enough water above that little hole so you don't continuously drag in air on that. So if we now repower the driver, you'll see that it'll start up normally. It'll still be dry running, so that's why we will now stop that error. So it's dry running. So now we're stopping it to keep it from dry running. And now we'll let out the air and put some water into it. If we switch it on now, the impeller wheel actually gets water and then it can go back into normal operation. But that's a big issue that actually can happen in your system. So if you don't design that correctly, you're actually building yourself a very, very bad trap. I can only recommend to try things like that out before you fill up your tank and stock it with, you know, all those expensive animals. Just make sure that your technology functions in the way that you assumed it. Like, try total power failure. Does anything overflow? Try a total blocking of all those plumbings and all those things. We call that a failure analysis, and you should really do that on your systems to make sure that your animals will be kept safe, even in case of a, you know, first little problem that can turn out into a very big problem. I hope you like that. If you have any other questions, please put them in the comments, like and subscribe. I hope I'll see you next Saturday. So far, have a great weekend and talk to you soon. Bye bye.